Thanks for joining us tonight. I won't wait. I'll get started so that we can start talking to Bruce and Kokum. Thanks for joining. I will start with a little bit of an intro to me, to us, to what we're doing here. So if you haven't met me before, where have you been? My name's Kerrin. I work for Betfair in Australia, and I head up our automation team, and we're responsible for people who are supporting people who are interested in automation and data on the exchange, which is why we're here. So what's the idea tonight? The idea is to help bring together people from our community who are interested in data, modeling and automation. So the focus tonight has a bit of a soccer bent, and that's in honor of our current Euro and Copa America's Datathon that's running at the moment. So we thought that a soccer focus was appropriate. So I've got a couple of guys who are into this tonight who are very interesting and good at what they do, and I'm really keen to talk with them. If you've joined before, you've heard me talk about my passion for community and for helping bring people together in this space. It can be a lonely journey, and the more that you can share with other people, the easier it is to stick it for the long run and to find something that works for you longer term. So that's what we're trying to achieve through providing this sort of meetup function. Hopefully going into next fin year, we might have the opportunity to do some of these in person again. We'll see how things play out, but definitely looking forward to sometime having a chance to catch up in person again. In the meantime, a couple of other things. So if you're not on the Betfair Quant Slack group, I do recommend you join. That's a really useful way to talk to people in the community, particularly in the Australian New Zealand space, but also a good way to talk to us and for us at Betfair to hear a little bit about what you guys are doing. It's community owned, so open to anyone who's interested in being there. If you aren't part of it, feel free to click the link below that Ash has just shared, or if you're watching your recording later and you can't see that link, shoot us an email, or for any other queries, at automation@betfair.com.au, and we'll help you out. So without further ado, what are we here for? Like we said, soccer focus because of our Datathon that's running at the moment. So we are asking you guys to predict the outcome of the Euro and Copa America's competitions that are due to run early next month. So the submission closed on the 11th of June. There are cash prizes. We like giving cash out. What's our drive here? It's purely to help people engage with sports modeling and to appreciate that using data that's available, you can build some pretty cool predictive models. And obviously later on, if you're interested, you can then look at automating them on the exchange if that's the way you want to go. But even well before that, you can use this data to do some pretty cool things, which is where the guys come in tonight. So I'll get Ash to share a link, there we go, to the Datathon page on the hub. Take a look, it's got all the details there of what we want for you. Basically, we want your ratings of each potential matchup through the two competitions, what you think the probabilities are going in. And we also provide pretty cool form and price data sets to help you have something to work from. So they're all available there. There are some tutorials there too if you're not familiar with sports modeling and or soccer modeling. And we'll talk through them a bit tonight because Kokum's been the one to write one of those tutorials for us. So really appreciate that. But enough from me. Bruce, I'd love to intro you to the gang. If I can get Bruce, there we go. Hi Bruce, thanks for joining this evening.
No worries.
It's funny because I don't think you're actually very far away. I think you're probably closer geographically than most of the rest of the guys. So once upon a time we would have done this in our hub in our office, but not at the moment. That's okay. So yeah, I appreciate you coming along. Can you share a bit about you, your history, what you did pre-Betfair, what your life looks like outside Betfair, how you got into modelling and automation?
Yeah, sure. So my background, I studied mathematics, computer science at university. I've basically been running businesses for most of my life. One of those was pricing for insurers, which has an awful lot of statistical modelling in it. So I have a background in statistical modelling. In terms of Betfair, in my adult life, I've had an interest in any kind of gambling where it's not a foregone conclusion that the house has an edge. And so I can't count playing blackjack. I've played video poker because there's anyone who's been to the US, there's video poker that has more than 100% payback if you play it perfectly. I play poker. When Betfair came around, that suggested that there was an opportunity in sports betting and betting on horse racing, because the trouble is betting on sports and horse racing through traditional bookmakers. As soon as you make some money from them, they kick you out, basically.
Hard to make the money in the first place, and then even harder to be sustainable, right?
That's right. Whereas, of course, Betfair doesn't really care if you make money, as long as you do it honestly.
We pretty actively care, especially in Australia. We want you to make money. If you don't make money, we don't make money. So,
Exactly. So I started off playing around with Betfair to basically do some scalping on horse races and some market making on particularly EPL and Test cricket. This was all manual. And, I had in my wish list, I made a bit of money doing this manually. I had on my wish list, it'd be nice to actually play with the API and automate this. But it was always honestly going to sit on my wish list forever and never get done. But then along came COVID and, there was nothing to do after work. Wasn't allowed out. And so I actually logged in and started playing around with the API.
Silver lining?
That's right.
Oh, I liked it as an approach. Well, that got you here. And in terms of what you bet on, what's the breadth of sort of sports racing? Are you very focused or more broad?
No, pretty broad, because the algorithms I use aren't especially market specific. There are markets they work better on, but it's more about the volatility of the market and compared to the volume of the market, that's whether they work or not. And so I'm betting on soccer, betting on basketball, horse racing, golf. I'm currently betting on AFL, though I'll probably turn that off shortly because the AFL's not making money. But that's really the main criteria is do I think my algorithms will work in that kind of market? And then if I think the answer to that's yes, then I'll try them out. And then when I've got enough results, it's either continue or turn it off. So
something I'm interested with you, like there aren't a whole heap of people in Australia who bet soccer programmatically. And I think that's partly that, and this is partly from experience and sort of looking at what other people are doing or not doing and conversations, but I think it's partly that it is quite hard to find an edge on soccer because the markets can be so efficient. From your perspective, and obviously I'm not asking you to give anything away, I'm just grateful you're here, but have you found that you've been able to find your space in those markets by looking more at market-based strategies, as in like looking at the way that the market's moving and responding to that, or more sort of predictive odds, model-based, I've got an opinion, I'm looking at form. What sort of approach have you found, or is it a mix of the two?
No, it's so I don't try and predict who's going to win. I don't care who's going to win. Most of the time, I am offering a back or a lay on every single selection in the market, and I'm basically seeking to perfectly match those at an edge.
Okay.
And you never perfectly match them, and so I do take some risk at the end of the day. And that risk I take, it's just more or less a coin toss whether that ends in my favour or not. It's the match stuff that I'm looking to make a profit on.
And do you think partly that you're making that it works for you more on, say, soccer than maybe AFL as your example, partly because there's more money in those markets? Is that just a hypothesis off the top of my head?
The it's a weird set of things that I think determine whether I make money or not. Partly it's about the volatility of the market. How much does the price change? And partly it's about because I'm offering a bet and a lay to anyone who'll take it, it's what percentage of the people taking it have some information that I don't have. And so if it's mainly, random punters that are taking the other side, I'm likely to make more money than if it's
smarter.
Clever people.
Yeah, I'm interested that you're finding an edge on soccer because generally it is more efficient and a bit smarter. So it's good. I approve. No, very, very, very interesting. And in your non-Betfair life, what does your other life look like in terms of, do you use the same set of skills, or is it other skills that you spend?
Not now. Right now I run a property investment fund and a property management business focused on short-term rentals.
Sure.
And I mainly manage people. So
it's interesting. As you go up, you tend to do that.
Yeah, exactly. And so using these skills that I've used in the past was just interesting relaxation, and
it keeps your head engaged, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I definitely get that. And there are a few people in the community who are in similar positions where they just want to keep using their brain in a different way. Regardless, the income's nice, but that stimulation and that challenge, I think, is as much part of the appeal, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Awesome. Well, we might just jump to Kokum and have an opportunity to intro him, and then we'll jump back to you. So if we swap over, we've got Ben Waite working his magic in the background, who always makes my life significantly easier. So heads up, Ben, thank you. And if we could have a video, ideally. There we go. Gotcha.
Okay, G.
Hello. So for anyone who doesn't know in the wider community, Kokum works for us in our data science team at Betfair. So a bit of background on you, Kokum. So thank you very much for joining. I really appreciate it. I always love it when we can use our internal sort of talents in things like this, because you get to see both sides of things. So thank you. And I owe you one. But back to you. So before Betfair, what's your life like? What are your skills like? Where do you come from? What's your view that makes it your perspective interesting?
Okay. Thanks for having me, first of all, and inviting me on this. So background, I think I'm a little bit mixed in that in terms of education, it's very technology based, it's engineering, computer science, but in terms of work, I've been always working with sports, modeling and analytics in sports, things like that. So started off with bachelor's in engineering, and then in my last year, I wrote this piece of code, this software that helps analyze badminton games. And then from that, I got hired by it's called the Malaysian Sports Institute. It's sort of like the Australian Institute of Sports, like in Canberra, where they serve all the national sports. And I was the analyst with the badminton team in Malaysia. And yeah, if somebody's done any sports analytics, it's like a lot of number crunching. It's a lot of manual, tedious work. So I did that for about 4 years, planning strategies, analyzing opponents. And then I was like, okay, there's got to be an easier way to do this. There's got to be a way for me to automate this and basically make my life easier, right? And I read up on things like machine learning and data modeling, and started talking with the professor that I knew from uni. And then he said, this is actually quite interesting. Do you want to come and do a PhD on this, and we'll sort you out with a scholarship? It's like, yeah, okay, sure.
Nice.
Let's do this. And I actually should say that company that I was working for, they were really nice. They let me have a few days and, go do my PhD, still continue to pay me. That was very helpful. but yeah, so I worked until the end of the Rio Olympics, and then graduated. So that was 2016,
Thank you.
2017. Yeah.
Mental
I
math.
could see. Yeah, I could see you thinking. I was like, yeah, okay, tell her. And then in 2018, I made a move to Melbourne. Got a job with Tennis Australia. They have a data science team called the Game Insight Group. Collaboration
cool.
with them and Victoria University. There I worked on a project with it was classifying emotions using video footage, so facial recognition, detecting landmarks on the face, and then can we tell from that how a player's feeling on court, whether they're angry, sad, whatever it was.
Not what you assume you're going to be doing when you sign up to do sports analytics of tennis.
Yeah, and to be honest, not what I thought I'd be doing when I was studying engineering. Like, it's not a typical engineering transition to move into sports. So I've been lucky because I'm a sports fan. I play sports. I watch sports. So it's been great to work with sports. But yeah, work with Tennis Australia, then another consulting gig with a company called H10, who's got also like sports clients, North American sports, European soccer, AFL here. And then with you guys since Jan this year.
Yeah, no, we're very, very lucky to have you and very happy to have you. And I'm very grateful that you're happy to share bits of that experience, particularly those more diverse approaches. We periodically we have these really cool conversations like in Slack and so on about how you can use particularly machine learning to model things that are a little outside the square. So, talking about what you can do with voice recognition and, and how those things can play out. But, things like the facial recognition stuff, like that's just really interesting and not happening a lot in the space. And I just think that, as you've already in your data science life sort of taken different views on things, I just think that your views can take a different edge on maybe, modeling in the sports space, but then what that looks like, in terms of modeling things for betting and for, automation, I just think it'd be really cool. So I'm very excited. And we're also, just as a shout out, part of what we're going to step through later, but really grateful to you for putting some time into writing a tutorial for anyone who hasn't modeled soccer before. Mm-hmm. So we'll share that later. But for people on the thing, what's your language of choice?
Very heavily Python. I'm all right with R. I think R and Python's become the two go-to languages in data science or data modeling at the moment. But I reckon Python has a bit more versatility. And again, I've just played around with Python a lot more. So that's the only reason.
Nothing wrong with Python. It's very, very popular, particularly in the community. So people will like to hear that. No, that will be very, very good to step through later. In your sort of modeling work, what sort of other outside of Python, what sort of tools and platforms do you use in what you do?
So if you're talking about my work, it's again
both
pretty much 100% Python. I feel comfortable enough with Python that if it was something else that I need to do, I can still automate it with Python. Yep. But I do reckon if somebody's getting into data and starting to work with data, there is always Excel. I think that's where everybody steps in. And then there's Microsoft-based platforms like Power BI, which is a place that's an easier transition for somebody who's used to something like Excel. Yeah.
I think the power of Excel these days is it teaches people to program without people realizing they're programming. Yeah. And to think algorithmically, like, so many people, some of the guys in our finance team, for example, who would absolutely balk at the idea of programming, but right, the most amazingly complicated and sophisticated nested ifs in these formulas. And at the end of the day, if you can do something like that, you are programming.
Yeah.
You know, it's thinking algorithmically. So I think that that's really valuable.
There's also something to R. Sorry,
No,
I was cutting you off, but I was thinking there is something to R that it's easier for somebody who don't have a formal education in programming to understand. That I feel like the syntax, the way that the language is written is easy. Like it's like speaking English. It's a bit of a smaller transition from speaking English to R. So that would be a good place to start as well.
And when we'll jump back to the tutorial in a little bit, but we've got another of the guys in our data science team who was kind enough to translate your Python tutorial into R for exactly that reason, so that we had that sort of cross-platform accessibility, right? So that it didn't matter where you were coming from. Cool. All right. Well, I'm going to jump back to Bruce and give you a moment, and then I will come back and we'll dig into that tutorial a little bit.
Sweet.
So thank you, Kokum. And hopefully I get Bruce back. It's not just me. There we go, gotcha. So my challenge to you was to think a little bit about some insights you might be happy to share into how you approach what you do, and things that you might have wished that you'd known a little earlier in your betting and modeling journey. What was in your mind when you were thinking about that?
Oh, look, I'd love a wealth of ready-to-use past data.
Oh,
that's the main thing I miss. I think what would I really love to what would I love to have known? I think where I've lost the most money is in markets where people know something very significant, and I ought to be able to know that they could know that. To give you a couple of extreme examples, I think the two places where I've lost the most on single markets are the toss for cricket, because Betfair close off. So unfortunately, with most markets, they start at the same time as the sport. However, the toss happens before the sport starts.
Yes.
And it's there in the terms and conditions. Betfair will suspend that market a certain number of minutes before the cricket starts. Doesn't mean the toss happens then. In fact, sometimes the toss happens before then, and people happily take and it's known your bets with the known result. So and my biggest losses are all of that kind. Yeah. Where
those edge cases, right?
Yeah, exactly. People.
Hey, can I ask, with that, have you put checks in to try and sort of catch that? And obviously you have, but something that some people will do is to go, if the market sentiment is X away from where I'm trying to offer, just back out, because obviously I'm off. Do you have some sort of approach like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the keys to market making is exactly that. When the market, to try and sense that the market's moving and move, preferably before the whole market moves. So when the market's starting to move, then move your idea of what the market's price is. And that certainly helps. But I think, these events have pushed me more extreme, which is also, if the market's moved a lot, just get out.
Yeah.
And manually decide whether you want to get back in or not.
Because obviously the market knows something you don't, right?
Yeah, that's certainly. For example, a player pulls out of the Australian Open. An hour before that, the odds move massively for that player winning the tournament. Presumably somebody knew something.
Yeah, and there's a rumour mill. No, I completely agree. It's something that when I'm talking to people about automating ratings-based models, it's something I always ask is well, what's the highest margin you'd be happy to take? And they look at me like I'm silly, sort of going, well, anything's amazing. I'm like, well, actually, let's come back and let's think about that, because, sometimes too good is too good. And, how much do you trust that your ratings, especially programmatically generated ratings, are 100% right? Because if there's too big a delta, almost undoubtedly you're missing something, and that's where using a bit of that market sentiment can really protect you, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Let's talk about data sources. So any insights you're happy to share in where you would source particularly historic soccer data?
Well, no, I'm afraid. You provided form data of past matches.
Yeah.
So that's obviously one of the key things you'd like to know. And I presume there'll be some past prices when those
that's going up next week too.
That'll come up, which is kind of the second thing you'd like to know. I think some Googling, you can probably turn up some public ELO models as starting points for international soccer, or rankings or ratings that might be of relevant potential interest. They might be useless too, but they might be of potential interest. Other than that, the other thing people, if you want to really go to town with your model, in team sports, the kind of first order model is where you just look at the team and how the team's gone recently. Yeah. One of the difficulties is there's not that many international soccer matches. And so the next place you could try and go is who's going to be playing and how are those players going and what are their player
models. Because player models are all the rage, in AFL and so on, which obviously in Australia we spend a lot of time on. Have you done much of that in soccer?
No, none. It's too much work.
It's just hard to get the data right and to match it all up and to take the right approach. Like, at least in the AFL space, there's Fitzroy and Footy Stats and all the different things that not Footy Stats, AFL Stats, all those different packages that people maintain. Whereas, I'm not sure about the player specific stuff in the soccer thing. I will share, because Ash did an awful lot of work in trying to find different form data sources over the last couple of weeks. So he's found 3 good ones. The 3 that he found were Football Reference, Footy Stats, and then an R package, which was the World Football R. Ash, maybe if you want to post just links to those in the chat for anyone who's keen. They were all interesting, and particularly that R package was really useful. So might be ones for you. In terms of what you said earlier about things going the wrong way. So I've got a question here from Paul, which I'll pose to you now, and it does speak to the same sort of thing, but specifically when you're talking about delayed games, especially if they can be delayed for days, what's your approach there? Like you said, you're offering prices, like, you're doing a bit of that pseudo market making, right? Are you just getting out, or are you letting it run? Like, how do you approach that if it's close to and then gets postponed?
Yeah. So, I said second question. So how early am I betting? I'm basically betting as early as I can, as soon as there's significant other parties in the market as well. In terms of delays, the main way I get out of a market if something, unexpected happens, is I just remove all of the bets and lays that are unmatched.
And just hold your position? Or?
Yeah, so I don't green. I don't neutralise my position. Because the main way that taking a risk in the market by leaving my existing matched positions in the market, that's a coin toss. The market might be about to move significantly for you or significantly against you.
Yeah.
And so there's a trade-off between how much it costs you to neutralise that position versus reducing the risk. And what I do is I just remove all my unmatched bets until I can form a new opinion on where the market is at.
Oh, that's a good response. I think it's so tricky, right? And just in terms of things like those delays, do you rely 100% on Betfair for, like, just the market data to tell you that the start time has been updated, or do you cross-reference that with other start times? Or
so So I use Betfair's information on start times, but generally they're delayed rather than brought forward. If they're brought forward, I'll start getting errors from Betfair, which is pretty handy. And if they're delayed, my code will just stop adding to the market at the time where I thought it was going to start, because I don't, I don't want to. It depends a bit on the sport, but there are many sports where a lot of information becomes available shortly before the start of the sport.
Yes.
And so I will typically widen my spreads on market making close to the start time, such that I'm much less likely to be matched.
Yeah.
And so, I'll naturally err in a way that basically has me not matching any bets.
So that you've got a better overround if you are getting matched.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's quite sensible, and you need that sort of thing, right? If you're, if you're going to find ways to, completely automated, be hands off, because you are, right. Your stuff runs completely without you. Yeah. So,
Yeah, that's right.
If you're not too risk averse, it often goes the wrong way. So, that's some really good insights. Thank you very much, Bruce. That's fascinating. I'm going to kick you back off for a sec, and Kokum's going to talk us through this tutorial he's put together, and then we'll grab you back, Bruce, for a Q&A. Thanks for putting those questions in there. If there's any other ones, keep adding them as we go. Awesome, Kokum. Do you want to screen share so you can talk us through this tutorial that you've written?
Yep.
Can you? Ben, you might need to enable that. Otherwise, I can probably screen share.
Maybe you can. Yeah.
Unless Ben can fix that.
Oh no, I can.
Good. Go, Ben. Awesome. So this is the Python version that you've put together, right?
Yep.
Cool. So obviously Ash will share the link, but so first up, before we walk through it, where would you position this tutorial on a beginner, intermediate, advanced scale in terms of modeling skills?
Yeah. So what I've done is I've sort of done a little bit of a walkthrough for a beginner.
Yep.
And my thought process on how the data should be cleaned or transformed in order to come up with a model.
Cool.
By no means is this an advanced model, or is it expected to give you really good results. It's more of a how to get started. Right? Yeah. And a few hints here and there on, what directions you might want to go through and what things you might want to Google and figure out if you are a beginner.
Do you want to talk us through it?
Yep. So I'm not going to go in deep in this, but I'll just high level summary of individual steps that I'm taking. The start of the code with Python is importing libraries that you need, and then you got to read the data that you've got with the CSV. I'm assuming that this data is in a particular format that me and Ash are expecting to send out as the data set that we have. And then I'm using a few of the features from that data set to build this model. I'm not using all of them. Using things like goal count, corners, total shots on target, fouls, and possession, things like that. Mm-hmm. The main thing to note here is that the data set it's form data, so it's got what happens during any match. It doesn't have who's won or lost, but you can infer that from the goal count. But the thing is, if we're trying to predict the outcome of a match at any given point, we don't have the data from that match, right? We actually have the data from before that. And I'm trying to transform this data set into a format where every single team has a row of data for that match leading up to that match, if that makes sense.
Yep.
Right. So eventually, after several steps, these fairly well explained in the tutorial, but basically I'm taking the stats from every team. I'm looking at the averages of those stats for the last 5 matches leading into that match.
Yep.
and then I'm taking the difference for team 1 versus team 2. So instead of going with, it's 4 goals to 2, it'll be 2 goal advantage for team 1, or a -2 if it's the other way around. And then modeling this and predicting on the variable, did team 1 win or lose or draw this match? And I've put down several different models that I'm evaluating, several different algorithms. Obviously, with these algorithms, some of them are sensitive to outliers. Some of them would need the data to be scaled in a particular way for them to perform better. But that's stuff that you can read up on and understand. Yeah. And then again, several evaluation metrics as well. How would you go about figuring out what your best model is?
Do you want to talk to that a little bit? So in terms of looking at what might be the best model, how would you judge that? I know you've gone through it here, but speaking to it a little bit.
Yeah. So in this particular code block, I'm looking at accuracy. My training and my fundamentals in machine learning tells me never go with accuracy, look at other stuff.
That's a good bit of feedback.
Yeah. Prediction probabilities in different classes, things like log loss, and depending on what you're looking for, do you want to look at what's called precision and recall? Those are 2 metrics based on your false positive and your false negative rates that you have. And there is something called a confusion matrix, which, if you don't know, it's a bit of a long explanation, but it's something that you can Google and figure out where, like, this kind of metrics tell you how accurate the model is, but how is it failing, and on which classes is it failing? Is it failing to predict wins, or is it failing to predict losses? And how would that determine your model's performance and your chances of winning basically this competition based on that?
So a couple of things I'll pick out from that just before I go to my next question to you. So first up, I will say that anyone who signs up for the Datathon direct from that link that Ash shared earlier, you'll get this form data in your download. So you'll get that straight away as soon as you sign up. We've also got some price data coming up in the next week or so, which will include the outcome. So whether it was a win or loss, as well as the price. So that would give you that win, which might be useful if people wanted to join on that. And then they could obviously look at back testing against those prices if they wanted to as well, in terms of model predictions versus actual probability. Might be interesting. The one that I love that you picked out of here, because it's such a noob thing, but everyone does it, is including the event, be that a match or race or whatever, in questions data in your prediction of that match. Like, everyone's done that, right? Like, I remember my first Greyhound model was so good, and that's because I managed to include the BSP of the dog for that race. We've all been there, so it's really good that you are calling out. And it's so tricky, but that absolute adage of only using data that you would have had at that point in time. And like you and I have discussed before, but it sounds so simple, but it's so easy to get caught up on, right?
Yeah. And it's probably worthwhile noting that, like, the more time that you spend cleaning and figuring out what the data is, and detecting outliers and getting rid of them, or basically cleaning your data set, the model performance would be better. I think the return for spending time cleaning the data set is
Huge,
quite
right?
high. Yeah.
So I had a
and
question
the actual modeling steps are like relatively easy. Yeah.
Especially if you're using like a machine learning approach, right?
Yeah.
Because then it's doing a lot of the heavy lifting. So in terms of that, I'm going to ask you this question. Bruce, if you want to listen, because I'm going to go to you after this for your thoughts on the same question, because this is pretty core to sort of the whole concept of a Datathon, and part of why we're here.
KG, sorry to disturb you, interrupt you, but there was a question earlier, and I thought of an answer,
please.
and I thought I want to share it before I forget.
Shoot.
The data sources, I think it's worthwhile looking at ratings from maybe, there are websites that have ratings on, tipping and stuff. It's probably worthwhile scraping those to get yourself some better results on this.
And that's worth comparing against, like, both as an input, but also as a bit of a sense check, right?
Yep.
Yeah, a bit like using the Betfair prices as a back tester or an input. No, definitely, that's a really good shout out. Sorry, I've got a question for you specifically before we jump back into my one, which is about retraining. So this is from Paul saying it can be a very subjective variable. How do you go about choosing when to move to a newly trained model? Let's start with the curly one.
So to answer this, I think the number one thing I want to preface by, like in my background, I do not do outcomes of sports matches because of my professional history. It's been player performance that I model rather than the outcome of the actual match itself. But I think for the player performance work, I've probably look at a model a year after. So one entire season's done, and then look back at the numbers we've got, look back at the model validation, see if anything's changed, and if it's changed for the worse, how can we improve it, and how can we retrain something, and then also obviously add in new data. But for something like this particular soccer model, if you're expected to give your predictions before the start of every round or every match, I assume retraining it with the last round matches would be helpful.
Yeah, and this is something like we talk about all the time because it's so hard when you're automated to know when something is just variance and when it's changed. And that's, I imagine part of your challenge in the past is dealing with real live people who you can't just go, oh, here's a new model, now do this. Here's a new model, now do this. There's some sort of people management in there, which is also challenging, which is good at one level because it forces you into more planned change cycles, good and bad. But then the bad is you're less agile, right? But, the good, you're not just jumping around every time your model starts performing a little strangely. Good answer though, especially given, I know sport is your background, not wagering. You're very much bringing a sports lens to this instead of a wagering lens, which is completely legitimate.
There's some, sorry.
There you go.
Now, there's also something interesting about the backtesting versus validation thought around model building. Like, since I've been at Betfair, I hear quite a bit about backtesting. For something like this soccer Datathon, where the matches during last year would have been severely disrupted, a typical machine learning validation approach might be better than backtesting.
I was going to have a question about that. I'm not sure whether you're the right person to ask it to, or it might be Bruce or a bit of both, but around how much you think that and actually, Ben, do you want to just pull Bruce into, and we'll stop sharing maybe Kokum, but
stop sharing this.
But around how much you're going to play in last year's data or ignore last year's data, because everything went so wacky and is still a little bit wacky. But, what have you done? I mean, obviously, Kokum, your approach was simply to like hand it to the machine learning and go, just figure it out, right? Is that fair?
Yeah. I mean, for this tutorial, yeah.
And do you think, obviously, sports guy, but do you think that you would take that same approach if you were taking this further? Or do you think you go, well, let's actually put last year to one side, or weight last year a little bit differently? Or are there other ways you could think of handling for that?
I think I would evaluate both. I put last year's data to aside and see if I validate my model on last year's matches, how the results would be. And I would also take a look at, I guess there is no way to, well, maybe I would cross-validate like a leave one out or a tenfold cross-validation, including last year's matches, and that would see how my model would generalize across the board. So if it's good across the board, then it's good.
What about you, Bruce? Have you, again, yours was more market movements, less, I'm trying to say race, but it's a match specific.
If I was trying to predict results of the match, the difficulty with international soccer is almost there's not that many matches.
Yeah.
And so it will be very hard to give yourself confidence of anything. However, in order to have a stab at that question of how big a deal is last year, and, is this year more similar to last year or before last year? The kind of way I'd go about that is to train based on data from before last year, see how predictive it was internally, and then see how predictive it was on last year to get a feel for, was last year crazy in terms of sport, or was it only crazy in terms of,
everything else,
our home lives? But then, of course, there's the next question of, we don't have any data about the year going forward. So, okay, let's say it is different last year. What are you going to do to predict next year? You're going to predict as if it was last year? You're going to predict as if it was the year before? You're going to take some mix of those two predictions. And I think that, there's not data that's going to tell you the answer to that. You're going to have to make a judgment call if you feel that, those time periods are an issue.
This was a particularly interesting one. So our last meetup, we had a focus on AFL, and we talked to Tony Cork, and particularly in AFL, because there have been quite a few rule changes as well. And then, the last year, there were some changes to the amount of time that was played, and the length of quarters and things like this, which made a big difference. So it was in soccer, it's less about those fundamental rule changes, more, well, who's doing what, who's where, how they're playing. But I think it is a relevant consideration nonetheless. I had a question, and I'll start with you on this one, Kokum, because I think you've got a particularly interesting take on this from our previous conversations. If you were to build something for a model, a model for, say, a Datathon like this, a competition, and you were trying to not necessarily game it, but obviously you want your submission to have the best chance of winning. Are there changes that you might make to your model or your model outputs with consideration for the scoring mechanism? So something that, when we had the Oz Open Datathon back at the beginning of the year, we had a conversation, and Nick, part of his feedback was that, well, he actually would say, taking outliers out of the output. So go, actually model, you're not allowed to predict anything to be below X or above Y, because you're going to be really punished on a log loss scoring system that, takes a pretty poor view of that. What was your take? Would you take a similar approach, or what would you advise?
Yeah, I mean, typically I would initially drop the outliers from the inputs. So
the
my model,
instead of the outputs.
As I train my model, I would drop the outliers from there, because if the model's not trained on outliers, hopefully it's not going to predict outliers. So if it's never seen a score line of 10-0, it's not going to predict 10-0 coming out. The approach of sort of having a threshold on the output is hard, because how do you decide what the threshold is and where the cutoffs are? So that I wouldn't necessarily go down that path myself.
Yeah. No, fair, cool. And this is why I'm asking it. So Bruce, what about you? Do you have a take on how you might model something for competition instead of for a betting reality?
So for betting reality versus a competition, it is quite different. So for the competition, you're going to measure log loss. If you are betting, the reality is, you've got a threshold probability at which you'll break even. if you're on one side of that probability, it doesn't matter what your error is, you're still going to win and you still should have bet. Yeah. And so, in reality, your error when you're betting is only about, is it on the other side of that threshold or not? So it's a very different kind of error function in what you do. Good thing is the model forms that would normally use to model do things like minimise the log loss. So we start pretty well there. But yeah, look, it'd be worth looking at the most extreme predictions from models, because you get punished for making an extreme prediction and being wrong. You get punished a lot.
Yeah, and that's sort of part of the approach there. Interesting one, and I'll pass this to you, Bruce, first, but question here, how would you go about pricing matches where the outcome has little meaning for one side? So an example here was Brighton's win at Man City when Man City were already champions, and therefore they might not care as much. Does that speak to sort of Kokum's outlier example, or it's hard when you're taking generic data in and you don't necessarily know all of that? What would your...
I think it's a different problem, which is basically, models will effectively take an average of all the past data, a clever kind of average. Essentially that's a feature. Man City didn't give a stuff about that match. You could add a column to your data, and because they're you know what I mean? The last round of the groups in the World Cup and Copa and so on, there are teams that if they draw, they get through. They might not be going for a win. They're just going to not look, so you could actually put that in as a feature that this was a dead rubber.
I like that. And maybe, as you said earlier, how do you have an edge over other people? Maybe that's part of your edge, is that you've actually done the legwork to know a little bit more about this beyond what's just in an Excel column, that you get otherwise. I like that's a good answer. Kokum, I'm going to pass this one to you, because we had a big discussion about this a couple of weeks ago. And Marco, kudos to you for asking the question. So I don't need to cede it. So soccer is a 3-outcome game. Normally, obviously, we've got A, B, or tie. Now, when we get to a competition structure like this, partway through, we get to a bit where we have knockout games. And we had so many conversations about how we were going to handle this in terms of a competition. So how would you plan to augment a model for a win-loss only when you get to those knockouts?
Am I using the same model, I guess, would be the...
Well, that's the first question.
The question, yeah.
Would you?
No. Instinctively, no. There may be a way to, put something around the output where I just drop the draw and predict the win or loss. But instinctively, if I was just going straight at it, I would build 2 models. I would back myself on the features and the data set that I would have, but the outcome variable would change and just have 2 models.
And you will notice, guys, if you're taking part in the competition, that the sample submission file that we've given you, it does go, A, B, draw, and make that very specific as to which game you're looking at, because of that exact problem. We're trying to make it easy for you to give it in the form that we need. Bruce, do you have a different take on that, or a similar take, or?
I've got an
opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think to get the best model, I think I'm in the same place that I'd have a second model, basically. But I'd also, for people that are either coming from, I've got data that has draws in it and I want a model that doesn't for some circumstances, or alternatively, there are a lot of modelling approaches that predict a binomial outcome.
And don't have
and so if people are comfortable with those and go, oh my God, there's draws in soccer, that's annoying. There's a pretty simple kludge that is reasonably accurate to get you from one to the other. And it's basically this. If 2 teams are pretty evenly matched, the probability of a draw will be about 30%. If 2 teams are not very evenly matched, so if one of them's, $9, $10, the probability of a draw will be about 15%. Okay. And you can roughly scale it in between. So if you had a model in either way and were worried about it, you could just use some simple
Ballpark.
scaling there to either remove the probability of a draw or add the probability. Well, removing the draw, you could just take the predictions on the win and the loss and divide by the remaining probability. If you've got predictions that don't have a draw, adding it in with this simple kludge, and this kludge just comes from assuming Poisson distribution of goals.
No, that's a good build on that. Thank you. I appreciate it. So, both of you, your history comes from modelling things that aren't soccer before you came to modelling soccer. Obviously, soccer focus here. Is there anything that you'd particularly highlight for anyone else? And I'm looking at the attendance list. I know there are a lot of people here who aren't soccer first. Like, they're not here because they're necessarily particularly interested in soccer. It's the modelling side. Is there any particular guidance, advice that you would give anyone who is coming to this with some modelling experience, but without necessarily any soccer experience? You said earlier, Bruce, about that example of like the coin toss in cricket. Are there other, gotchas or just guiding principles that you'd share for anyone starting with soccer as opposed to anything else? Either or.
I think we've covered the big ones. Draws. The fact that we're about to model international soccer, which is this irregular mess where players don't show up because they've got better things to do sometimes, and sometimes it's important. Depends whether it's the World Cup or whether it's just a lesser international. That's a big issue. Dead rubbers are a big issue.
Yeah. I would say home and away. I think there might be some differences there with soccer. And if I was building a model, I would try out including, competitive matches and dropping the friendlies and then trying the friendlies in potentially. I don't know if there's a way to evaluate the lineups and see if the teams are, trotting out their second 11, but yeah.
No, that's really useful. And my other question for you, just before we sort of wrap up, for you, Bruce, specifically, because you mentioned earlier about pricing data. How would you use historic pricing data in building or validating a predictive model like this? Would you use it as an input or a back tester or both? Or
primarily, it's so long as actually there's no Betfair start prices in soccer, so you're safe here. But primarily, it's another feature that you can use if it's useful. That's the primary use of it. You could also use it to try and understand. Looking at last year versus the year before. You'll only get a little bit of information based on the actual results because there's not that much information content with a small number of results. You'll actually get a lot more information content by looking at the odds just before the match started and whether they're materially different from the prior year or not.
And that's part of what we're giving you, I think, is last traded price along with min and max. It's interesting. I'm really glad that you went straight to feature because it's interesting how many people I talk to when I talk about historic price data and they go, well, what's that useful for? And they just don't even consider that it might be valuable as a feature. But, there is, basically it's agreed that there's no better gauge of the wisdom of the crowd than an efficient Betfair price. And in soccer, kind of by definition, it's normally pretty efficient. So, it's interesting to see that you're using it that way. Would either of you have any closing comments you wanted to add before we wrap up?
Not here.
No. Good.
No, I will say anyone who has any other questions or thoughts, both the guys have very kindly offered to be available in Slack. If you want to jump over there and jump into the meetups channel and at either of them, both very generous guys who are giving you their time. So if you have any other burning things that come to you or you didn't think of here, feel free to hit them up there. I will say to both of you, thank you very much for joining and for sharing, both of your experience and your insights. I definitely think it's fascinating. I like soccer a lot more than a lot of other sports. I don't pretend to know a lot of it, but I like soccer a lot more than others. So I've found this interesting too. So thank you both very much. do appreciate it, and I owe you both. Let's say a drink. So thank you. More generally, though, anyone who is interested in the Datathon, like I said, you've still got a few weeks. It's the 11th of June that submissions close when the competition starts. As in I think it's the Euro starts first. If you've got any questions, hit up datathon@betfair.com.au. Ash is your go-to there. He's also on Slack, so you can hit him up there. And he's done a lot of legwork behind this, so I need to give him huge kudos there. But yeah, so there's form data and price data available, and a chance for some very nice cash. I don't think I'm allowed to say how much on here, but some very nice cash. Go and take a look and you can see. And what's up next? So a couple of things on the horizon, some pretty cool stuff coming up. Our next webinar will be on Greyhound form data and how to use that in your models. So I think that's the 23rd of June. So save the date. That should be coming out to you in our next automation newsletter, which should go out the week after next. So keep an eye out for that, because that'll be very interesting. I'm biased, but I think it's very interesting. Yeah, and like we said, Datathon, and there's the tutorials as well online if you need a little bit of support there. So thanks guys for that. And then from here, if you're keen, you're welcome to stay online and join us for our pub session. So Ben will drop the link in the chat down there. But if you just want to get on with me and a couple of the other guys and just have a chat about where you're at and what you're doing, pick other people's brains, you're very, very welcome to. Ben's just dropped that in the chat, and he'll drop it in Slack as well. Thank you both for joining. Thanks, Kokum. Thanks, Bruce. Thanks, Ash and Ben, for all the back end work and getting it all sorted. I appreciate that. Otherwise, stay safe, have a great evening, and hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks, Kerrin.
Thanks, KJ.
Bye.